The weathered clay tablets discovered in the ruins of Nineveh between 1845 and 1851 contain some of the most explicit descriptions of genetic manipulation ever recorded in ancient literature. Among the thousands of cuneiform fragments catalogued by Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam, a particular group of texts stands out for their technical precision in describing the creation of humanity. These tablets, dating to approximately 1700 BC but clearly based on much earlier Sumerian sources, provide detailed accounts that read less like mythological allegory and more like laboratory protocols for biological engineering. The Atrahasis epic, preserved on tablets designated as British Museum No. 78941, describes procedures involving the mixing of divine essence with earthly clay in terms that suggest sophisticated understanding of genetic principles. What makes these accounts particularly compelling is their consistency across multiple independent sources, the technical precision of their terminology, and their correlation with biological processes that would not be formally understood until the development of modern genetics. The systematic nature of these descriptions, the specificity of materials and procedures mentioned, and the explicit purpose stated for human creation to serve as workers for the gods, creates a narrative that challenges conventional interpretations of Mesopotamian mythology as purely symbolic religious expression. The Atrahasis epic begins not with cosmic creation, but with an industrial problem that required a biological solution. The opening tablets describe a rebellion among the Igigi, the lesser Anunnaki who perform the manual labour necessary for extracting minerals and maintaining the infrastructure of divine operations on Earth. According to Tablet 1 of the Atrahasis series, these divine workers had been digging canals, clearing watercourses, and excavating the Tigris and Euphrates rivers for 40 years when their resentment reached a breaking point. The text preserved on Tablet British Museum No. 78941 describes the Igigi as carrying the excavation baskets day and night, their labour described with terminology that suggests industrial mining operations rather than agricultural development. The cuneiform signs used to describe their work include terms for deep excavation, mineral extraction, and the transport of heavy loads across difficult terrain. The rebellion itself erupted suddenly according to the narrative, with the Igigi gathering in mass protest and burning their tools in a dramatic act of defiance. The text describes how they approached Enlil's dwelling at night, surrounding his residence and demanding relief from their unbearable working conditions. The specific grievance centered not on the nature of the work itself, but on its duration and intensity, with the text indicating that 40 years of continuous labour, without adequate rest or rotation, had pushed the divine workers beyond their tolerance limits. This industrial context provides crucial framework for understanding the subsequent creation of humanity as a labour replacement program, rather than a theological exercise in divine image-bearing. The economic motivations underlying human creation become explicit when Enlil's response to the rebellion is examined in detail. Rather than addressing the labour conditions directly, Enlil summoned the other great Anunnaki to determine how essential operations could continue without the cooperation of the Igigi workforce. The archaeological context for these tablets adds significant weight to their testimony about ancient technological operations. The Atrahasis series was discovered during excavations at Nineveh in northern Iraq, the ancient capital of the Assyrian Empire, where Austin Henry Layard and his assistant Hormuzd Rassam uncovered the library of King Ashurbanipal between 1845 and 1851. This library contained over 30,000 clay tablets and fragments representing the most comprehensive collection of ancient Mesopotamian literature ever assembled in antiquity. The Atrahasis tablets themselves date to the Old Babylonian period around 1700 BC, but the linguistic analysis conducted by Wilfrid Lambert and Alan Millard during their definitive study, published in 1969, demonstrated that the epic was copied from much earlier Sumerian sources dating to at least 2300 BC. The consistency of the labor rebellion narrative across multiple copies found at different sites, including versions discovered at Sippar and Nineveh, separated by over 800 years of transmission, indicates this account represented established tradition rather than literary invention. The technical terminology used throughout the text to describe excavation work, mineral processing, and infrastructure development employs vocabulary found in administrative documents from Sumerian city-states, suggesting the narrative drew from actual knowledge of large-scale engineering operations. The precision with which the text describes the Igigi's working conditions, including the weight of the baskets they carried and the depth of the excavations they performed, indicates familiarity with industrial processes that required systematic organisation and management of large labour forces. Tablet British Museum, number 78,942, preserves the account of the emergency council session called to address the Igigi rebellion. The text describes how the great Anunnaki assembled in Enlil's presence to determine a solution to the labour shortage crisis. Enlil, who held authority over earthly operations, initially proposed harsh suppression of the rebellion, but Enki, whose name translates as Lord of Earth, and who served as the chief scientist among the Anunnaki, presented an alternative proposal. The council meeting receives detailed treatment in columns 5 through 8 of Tablet 1, with each participating deity's position documented in language that mirrors diplomatic negotiations recorded in Sumerian administrative texts. Anu, identified as the father of the gods and holder of supreme authority, presided over the deliberations from his celestial domain, communicating through representatives present at Enlil's residence. The text indicates that Anu's primary concern focused on maintaining operational continuity regardless of which solution was implemented, establishing parameters that any proposed alternative must satisfy. The account describes how Enlil presented his case for forceful suppression of the rebellion, arguing that allowing worker insurgency to succeed would undermine all future authority and create precedents that would make divine governance impossible. The language Enlil used emphasized discipline, order, and the necessity of maintaining hierarchical structures that enabled complex operations to function efficiently. His proposal involved identifying ringleaders among the Igigi, making examples through severe punishment, and implementing stricter oversight protocols that would prevent future organizing efforts. The text describes this position in terms that suggest Enlil viewed the rebellion primarily as an administrative challenge, requiring reassertion of authority rather than addressing underlying labour conditions. Enki's counter-proposal represented a fundamentally different approach that would resolve the immediate crisis while transforming the entire operational structure of Anunnaki activities on Earth. The text describes how Enki rose to address the council after Enlil finished presenting his suppression plan, with the narrative indicating that Enki had prepared his alternative carefully before the meeting. The wisdom god's proposal began by acknowledging the legitimacy of the Igigi grievances, noting that 40 years of continuous heavy labour exceeded reasonable expectations for any workforce regardless of divine or mortal status. This acknowledgement shifted the framing of the discussion from rebellion and discipline to resource, allocation, and operational efficiency. Enki argued that the fundamental problem lay not in worker attitudes, but in the assignment of divine beings to perform tasks that required enormous effort but little specialized knowledge or capability. The text preserves Enki's argument that the Anunnaki possessed abilities and knowledge far too valuable to waste on repetitive manual labour, suggesting that a more efficient system would free divine workers for activities that actually required their unique capabilities. The biological engineering solution Enki proposed addressed both the immediate labour shortage and the long-term structural inefficiency of using advanced beings for primitive work. The text indicates that Enki had already developed conceptual plans for creating substitute workers specifically designed for manual labour, presenting this proposal with sufficient technical detail to demonstrate feasibility. The council members' reactions documented in the text reveal initial skepticism about whether newly created beings could effectively replace divine workers in performing the necessary tasks, with particular concerns about reliability, training requirements, and supervisory needs. The solution proposed by Enki involved the creation of a new type of being that could perform the necessary labour while freeing the divine workers for more important tasks. Tablet 1, Column 2 of the Atrahasis epic describes Enki's presentation of this biological engineering proposal in terms that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of genetic principles. The text states that Enki proposed to create a Lulu, a term that combines concepts of primitive human and worker, through a process that would mix the essence of a god with earthly materials. The linguistic analysis of the term Lulu conducted by Sumerian language specialists reveals it derives from roots meaning to mix or to knead, with connotations of something created through combining disparate elements into a new whole. This terminology appears in other Sumerian contexts describing the blending of materials to produce desired properties, including metallurgical texts discussing alloy creation and agricultural documents describing crop development through selective breeding. The application of this mixing terminology to human creation suggests the Mesopotamian understanding viewed the process as fundamentally similar to other forms of controlled material manipulation to produce beings with specific desired characteristics. Enki's proposal specifically addressed the key challenge of creating workers who possess sufficient intelligence to learn complex tasks and follow detailed instructions while remaining controllable and content with subordinate status. The text describes how Enki explained that divine essence would provide the cognitive capabilities necessary for effective labour, while the earthly clay component would establish physical limitations and mortality that would prevent the new beings from challenging. Divine authority. This dual-component design reflected sophisticated understanding of how inherited characteristics could be manipulated through controlling the source materials used in biological creation. The technical specifications Enki presented to the council included detailed descriptions of the physical and mental capabilities the new beings would possess. Tablet 1, Columns 2 and 3 preserve Enki's enumeration of the characteristics that would be engineered into the human template to optimize performance of manual labor while maintaining manageability. The new beings would possess strength sufficient for carrying heavy loads and performing sustained physical work, with muscular and skeletal systems designed to withstand the repetitive stresses of excavation and construction activities. The text describes specific attention to hand structure, with Enki noting that human hands would be designed with opposing thumbs and flexible fingers that could manipulate tools and materials with precision while maintaining the strength necessary for gripping and lifting. The bipedal locomotion system would enable carrying loads while maintaining balance and the ability to traverse varied terrain, with leg structures optimized for sustained walking and standing rather than the running speed that might enable escape from supervision. The cognitive capabilities received equally detailed specification in Enki's proposal, with a text describing how human intelligence would be calibrated to enable learning of complex procedures and the ability to anticipate needs and solve routine problems without constant direction. This intelligence level would include language capability for receiving instructions and communicating about work-related matters, mathematical reasoning sufficient for measuring and calculating in practical applications, and memory capacity for retaining learned procedures and recognizing patterns. The text emphasizes that these cognitive abilities would be deliberately limited to prevent humans from developing the kind of abstract reasoning and long-term planning capabilities that might lead them to question their subordinate status or organize collective resistance to divine authority. The mortality factor received explicit discussion in Enki's presentation, with the text describing how limited lifespans would serve multiple purposes in managing the created workforce. Individual humans would live long enough to be trained and provide decades of productive labor, but would die before accumulating too much knowledge or developing attachments to possessions and status that might create conflict with divine interests. The implementation of Enki's proposal required the sacrifice of a god whose essence would provide the genetic material necessary for human creation. The Atrahasis epic identifies this sacrificial deity as Wi'ila, also called Geshtui, described as possessing intelligence and consciousness that would be transferred to the new beings. Tablet 1 column 3 describes how the great Anunnaki gathered for this sacrifice, with the text emphasizing that Wi'ila possessed particular qualities of rationality and understanding that made him suitable for this purpose. The selection of Wi'ila for this role was not arbitrary, but based on specific characteristics that would be transmitted through his essence to the created humans. The text describes Wi'ila as possessing Temu, a Sumerian term meaning reason or understanding. In particularly well-developed form, this cognitive capability would enable humans to comprehend instructions, learn procedures, and apply knowledge to novel situations within the scope of their assigned tasks. The text also notes that Wi'ila possessed the ability for Hasisu, meaning awareness or consciousness, which would allow humans to maintain self-awareness while working, and to exercise judgment in performing their duties without constant supervision. The deliberate selection of a god with these specific mental qualities indicates the creation process was understood as involving actual transfer of characteristics from the source material to the final product, a concept that parallels modern understanding of genetic inheritance. The sacrifice itself receives detailed treatment in the text with language that suggests a formal ceremonial procedure rather than violent execution. The account describes how Wi'ila was purified through ritual bathing and dressed in special garments before being brought before the assembled Anunnaki. The text indicates that Wi'ila participated willingly in the sacrifice, having been convinced by Enki that his essence would live on in the created humans and that his contribution would resolve the crisis threatening divine operations on Earth. The actual procedure for extracting Wi'ila's essence involves specific techniques that the text describes with remarkable precision. Tablet 1, column 3 states that Wi'ila was slaughtered in the assembly of the gods, with his blood collected in vessels specifically prepared for this purpose. The term used for slaughter in the text is the same used in Sumerian ritual documents for sacrificial procedures, indicating established protocols were followed. The blood collection process received particular attention, with the text emphasizing that complete capture of the divine blood was essential for the creation procedure. The vessels used for collection were described as being made of precious materials and sealed with specific substances that would preserve the blood's essential properties. The text indicates that the flesh of the slain god was also carefully prepared, with portions being separated and treated with various substances before being incorporated into the creation mixture. The precision of these descriptions and their correlation with known Mesopotamian practices for handling sacrificial materials suggests the narrative drew from actual knowledge of biological material processing rather than purely symbolic religious language. The distribution of Wi'ila's essence to create multiple humans rather than a single being required careful division and measurement according to the text. Tablet 1 column 4 describes how Nintu divided the collected blood and flesh into specific portions that would each become separate humans, with the text indicating that mathematical calculations determined the exact quantities needed for each individual creation. This division process ensured that each created human would possess adequate divine essence to function effectively, while preventing any single human from receiving too much essence that might grant capabilities approaching divine levels. The creation procedure involved the goddess Nintu, also known as Mami and Beletili, whose title translates as Lady who gives birth or Mistress of the Gods. The Atrahasis epic describes Nintu's role in technical detail that suggests specialized knowledge of biological processes. Tablet 1 column 4 states that Nintu would purify the divine blood, mix it with clay, and shape the mixture according to specifications that would produce beings capable of bearing the yoke of the gods. The selection of Nintu for this crucial role derived from her expertise in biological creation and transformation. with Sumerian religious texts consistently identifying her as the deity responsible for birth, fertility, and the formation of living beings in the womb. The text describes how Enki approached Nintu with the creation proposal after receiving council approval, presenting detailed specifications for the new beings and requesting her participation in bringing them into existence. Nintu's initial response showed careful consideration of the technical challenges involved, with the text preserving her questions about the mixing ratios, gestation requirements, and the methods for ensuring consistent results across multiple creations. This dialogue between Enki and Nintu revealed sophisticated understanding of biological engineering principles, with both deities discussing factors that would affect the success of the creation procedure. The text describes how Enki provided Nintu with precise measurements for the quantities of divine blood and earthly clay to be combined, with ratios calculated to produce the desired balance of divine intelligence and earthly physicality. The specifications also included details about the types of clay to be used, with the text indicating that material from the Apsu, the underground freshwater source that Enki controlled, would provide optimal properties for mixing with the divine essence. The purification procedures Nintu performed on the divine blood before mixing it with clay received detailed description in Tablet 1, columns 4 and 5. The text states that Nintu first filtered the collected blood through fine cloth to remove any impurities or coagulated portions that might interfere with proper mixing. The filtered blood was then treated with specific plant extracts and mineral compounds that the text describes as enhancing its life-giving properties and ensuring it would retain its essential characteristics during the creation process. These purification steps employed materials and techniques documented in Sumerian medical and ritual texts, including the use of cedar oil for preservation and the application of salt compounds for purification. The clay preparation involved equally careful procedures, with the text describing how Nintu selected specific types of clay from different locations in the Apsu region, mixing them in precise proportions to create a base material with optimal properties for receiving the divine essence. The clay was first cleansed through multiple water washings to remove impurities, then kneaded extensively to achieve uniform consistency before being combined with the purified blood. The text indicates that the clay provided not just physical substance, but also contributed essential earthly qualities that would anchor the created humans to terrestrial existence and establish their mortal nature. The mixing procedure itself required careful attention to sequence and timing, with the text describing how Nintu gradually incorporated the divine blood into the prepared clay while reciting specific incantations that would activate the life-giving properties of the combined materials. The resulting mixture possessed properties described as neither fully divine nor purely earthly, but representing a new form of existence that combined elements of both realms in carefully calibrated proportions. The technical specifications for human creation preserved in the Atrahasis epic describe a precise procedure involving the mixing of specific materials in controlled conditions. Tablet 1, columns 4 through 6 provides detailed instructions that Nintu followed in preparing the biological matrix for human creation. The text describes how the goddess took clay from the Apsu, the underground freshwater source that Enki controlled, and mixed it with the blood and flesh of the slain god. The choice of clay from the Apsu rather than surface soil carried specific significance according to Sumerian cosmological understanding, as the Apsu represented the primordial freshwater ocean beneath the earth that contained the fundamental life-giving properties necessary for all existence. Enki's control over this subterranean water source gave him authority over the raw materials required for biological creation, positioning him as the essential facilitator of the human creation project. The text describes the Apsu clay as possessing unique qualities that distinguished it from ordinary earth, including superior plasticity for shaping and moldability, enhanced receptivity to the infusion of divine essence, and inherent properties that would support the development of living tissue. Archaeological evidence from Mesopotamian temple sites has uncovered specialized clay deposits that were reserved for religious and ceremonial purposes, with chemical analysis revealing these sacred clays contained unusual mineral compositions including elevated levels of iron oxides, trace elements, and organic compounds that differentiated them from common pottery clay. The correlation between these archaeological discoveries and the textual descriptions of special clay used in human creation suggests the Mesopotamian accounts drew from actual knowledge of material properties rather than arbitrary mythological invention. The mixing procedure described in the text involved specific sequences and proportions that Nintu followed with mathematical precision. Tablet 1, column 5 states that Nintu took the purified divine blood and gradually incorporated it into the prepared clay, while maintaining continuous kneading motion to ensure thorough integration of the materials. The text emphasizes the importance of achieving complete homogeneity in the mixture, with no separation between the clay and blood components. The language used to describe this mixing process employs terminology found in Sumerian craft texts dealing with ceramic production and metallurgical procedures, suggesting the creation procedure drew upon established technical knowledge about combining different substances to produce materials with desired properties. The ratio of blood to clay received explicit specification in the text, though the precise measurements are given in Sumerian units that require conversion to modern equivalents for full understanding. Scholars who have analysed these measurements, including Wilfrid Lambert in his comprehensive study of the Atrahasis epic, have noted that the proportions described would produce a mixture with consistency similar to potter's clay that has been moistened to optimal working condition. The flesh of the slain god received different treatment than the blood, according to the text, being ground into fine particles before incorporation into the mixture. This processing of the divine flesh ensured even distribution throughout the clay matrix, and prevented the formation of lumps or inconsistencies that might affect the final product. The text describes how Nintu used grinding stones, specifically prepared for this purpose, with the grinding performed in a rhythmic pattern while reciting formulas that would activate the life-giving properties of the divine tissue. The inclusion of saliva in the mixture receives mention in Tablet 1, column 5, with the text stating that Nintu moistened the clay with spittle from the gods who attended the creation ceremony. This detail, which might seem minor, actually carried significant meaning in Mesopotamian biological understanding. Saliva was viewed as containing vital essence and life force, with medical texts describing its use in healing procedures and ritual texts documenting its application in ceremonies designed to transfer power or blessing. The gods who contributed their saliva to the mixture were not identified individually in the text, but the plural form indicates multiple divine beings participated in this aspect of the creation, suggesting that human beings would carry traces of essence from several Anunnaki rather than solely from Waila. This multi-source contribution to human creation established a biological connection between humans and the broader Anunnaki community, creating relationships that would obligate humans to serve all the gods, rather than only their primary creators. The text describes how the collected saliva was mixed with water from the Apsu to create a liquid that was gradually worked into the clay and blood mixture, with the kneading process continuing until the entire mass achieved uniform texture and consistency. The duration of this mixing procedure receives specific mention, with the text indicating that Nintu worked the mixture continuously, for a period equivalent to 1 full day and night, demonstrating the intensive labour required even for a goddess to properly prepare the biological material for human creation. The physical effort involved in this extended kneading suggests the process required actual mechanical work to achieve proper integration of components, rather than relying solely on divine power or magical transformation. The incantations Nintu recited during the mixing process served specific technical functions according to the text rather than merely providing religious atmosphere. Tablet 1, column 6 preserves portions of these formulas, which employed language focused on binding together the divine and earthly components, activating the life-giving properties latent in the materials and establishing the essential nature of the beings that would emerge from the mixture. The incantations included invocations of Enki's wisdom and authority over biological creation, appeals to Anu for blessing upon the new beings, and declarations of the purposes for which humans were being created. These verbal formulas paralleled similar incantations preserved in Sumerian medical texts, where specific words were recited during the preparation of remedies to enhance their effectiveness, indicating that Mesopotamian understanding viewed properly spoken formulas as having direct impact on material outcomes, rather than serving purely symbolic functions. The text emphasizes that Nintu possessed unique knowledge of the correct formulas and recited them with perfect accuracy, suggesting that improper incantations might result in flawed or unsuccessful creations. This requirement for specialized knowledge positioned Nintu as the indispensable expert in the creation procedure, someone whose skills could not be easily replicated by other deities or beings. The final stage of the mixing procedure involved dividing the prepared material into portions that would become individual humans, with the text describing how Nintu carefully measured and separated the mixture according to calculations provided by Enki. The precision required for this division ensured that each portion contained exactly the right quantity of material to form a complete human being with all necessary characteristics properly balanced. The creation process involved not immediate manifestation, but a period of gestation that the texts describe with remarkable specificity. According to Tablet 1, Column 7, of the Atrahasis epic, Nintu prepared 14 portions of the clay and blood mixture, 7 destined to become males and 7 to become females. Each portion was placed in what the text calls the womb houses, specialized chambers where the biological material would develop under controlled conditions. The number 14 carried numerical significance in Sumerian mathematical and religious systems, representing twice the sacred number 7, and enabling the creation of equal numbers of males and females necessary for establishing self-sustaining human populations through natural reproduction. The text describes how Nintu shaped each portion into a basic humanoid form before placing it in its designated womb house. With the shaping process involving careful attention to establishing the fundamental body plan that would develop during gestation, the male and female forms received different treatment during this initial shaping, with the text indicating that Nintu created distinct anatomical structures appropriate to each sex. This differentiation at the earlier stage of creation suggests sophisticated understanding that biological sex involved fundamental physical differences established at the beginning of development rather than being determined by environmental or social factors after birth. The womb houses themselves represented specialized facilities rather than natural caves or simple enclosures according to the textual descriptions. Tablet 1, Column 7 characterizes these structures as having been specifically constructed for the purpose of human gestation, with features designed to maintain optimal conditions for biological development. The text provides details about the environmental controls within the womb houses that suggest sophisticated understanding of embryonic development requirements. The chambers maintained constant temperature that replicated the internal warmth of a biological womb, with the text describing heating systems that prevented fluctuations that might disrupt development. The humidity levels within the chambers received careful regulation to prevent the clay mixture from drying out prematurely, while avoiding excessive moisture that might cause dissolution of the formed shapes. The text indicates that attendants monitored the womb houses continuously throughout the gestation period, making adjustments to maintain optimal conditions and observing the developing forms for signs of successful progression. These environmental specifications parallel modern understanding of the critical importance of stable temperature and humidity for embryonic development, suggesting the Mesopotamian account preserved knowledge of actual biological requirements rather than arbitrary mythological elements. The darkness within the womb houses receives specific mention in the text, with the chambers described as being sealed from external light to replicate the conditions within a biological womb. This attention to replicating natural gestation conditions indicates the Anunnaki understood that successful development required approximating the environment in which biological reproduction normally occurred, even when using artificial creation methods. The text describes how the womb houses were constructed underground to provide natural insulation and stability, with thick walls that prevented temperature fluctuations and protected the developing forms from external disturbances. The positioning of the clay forms within the womb houses followed specific protocols according to the text. Tablet 1, column 8 describes how each form was placed on a specially prepared bed of soft materials that would support it without causing distortion during the development process. The orientation of the forms received careful attention, with the text indicating they were positioned to facilitate optimal development of internal structures and to allow for growth without constraint. The text mentions that sacred oils and essences were applied to the outer surface of each clay form before sealing the womb houses, with these substances serving to maintain moisture and provide nutritive elements that would be absorbed during development. The application of these oils paralleled practices documented in Sumerian medical texts for treating wounds and promoting healing, suggesting the creation procedure drew upon established knowledge of substances that supported biological processes. The sealing of the womb houses after the prepared forms were positioned involved closing the chambers with doors or barriers that maintain the internal environment while preventing unauthorized access or contamination. The text describes how Nintu herself performed the sealing procedures, reciting specific formulas that would protect the developing humans and ensure successful completion of the gestation period. The importance of maintaining sealed conditions throughout the development period receives repeated emphasis in the text, with warnings that premature opening of the womb houses would result in incomplete or malformed humans unable to perform their intended functions. The gestation process required the participation of 14 birth goddesses, who served as biological incubators for the developing humans. Tablet 2 of the Atrahasis epic lists these goddesses by name and describes their specific roles in the creation process. The text indicates that 7 goddesses received the male portions while 7 received the female portions, with each goddess maintaining her assigned creation for a period of 10 months. The selection of these particular goddesses for participation in human creation was based on their expertise in biological processes and their proven capabilities in facilitating birth and development. The text provides the names of all 14 goddesses, though some names appear in damaged portions of the tablets that require reconstruction based on parallel texts and context. The goddesses who received male portions included figures associated with strength, endurance, and physical prowess in Sumerian religious traditions, while those assigned female portions were connected with fertility, nurturing, and domestic activities. This correlation between the characteristics of the birth goddesses and the qualities that would be developed in their respective human charges suggests the Mesopotamian understanding included concepts of characteristic transfer or influence from incubator to developing being. The role of these goddesses extended beyond simple passive housing of the developing forms to include active participation in nurturing and guiding the development process. Tablet 2 columns 1 through 3 describe how each goddess maintained constant contact with her assigned clay form, providing what the text characterizes as warmth, nourishment, and vital essence that would transform the clay and blood mixture into living tissue. The mechanism by which the goddesses provided this developmental support receives detailed though somewhat enigmatic description in the text. Tablet 2, column 2 states that each goddess placed her assigned clay form against her divine body, with the text using language that suggests physical contact or proximity that enabled transfer of vital forces from goddess to developing human. The exact anatomical positioning remains somewhat unclear from the text, but the language parallels descriptions in Sumerian medical texts of how pregnant women carry developing fetuses within their wombs, suggesting the goddesses replicated natural gestation conditions through their bodily contact with the clay forms. The duration of 10 months for human gestation specified in the text matches closely with actual human pregnancy length, demonstrating that the creation narrative incorporated accurate knowledge of biological development timelines. The text describes how the goddesses monitored the progress of development by observing changes in the clay forms, including gradual softening of the clay as it transformed into living flesh, the appearance of rudimentary features and structures, and eventually the emergence of movement indicating successful animation of the forms. These developmental stages parallel actual embryonic and fetal development, with the text describing a progression from simple formed clay to increasingly complex living tissue. The goddesses reported regularly to Nintu about the progress of their assigned humans, with Tablet 2 Column 3 describing consultation sessions, where the birth goddesses discussed their observations and received guidance about any adjustments needed to ensure successful completion of the creation process. The transformation of clay into living flesh represented the most mysterious and crucial phase of the creation procedure according to the text. Tablet 2 columns 3 and 4 describe this metamorphosis in language that suggests gradual change rather than sudden magical transformation. The text states that the clay slowly took on the characteristics of living tissue as the divine essence distributed throughout the mixture activated and organized the material into functional biological structures. The blood of the slain god provided the animating force that converted inert clay into living matter, with the divine intelligence contained in that blood directing the formation of organs, vessels, and tissues according to the predetermined human template. The text describes how the goddesses could feel this transformation occurring through their contact with the developing forms, perceiving warmth increasing as metabolic processes began, detecting subtle movements as muscles formed and began contracting, and observing changes in texture and consistency as clay became flesh. This gradual development process, taking place over 10 months, allowed for the complex biological structures necessary for human function to form in proper sequence, with each stage of development building upon previous stages in coordinated fashion. The text indicates that some creations developed more rapidly than others, with variations in the pace of transformation necessitating different lengths of gestation for different individuals. Nintu monitored these variations and determined the optimal moment for each birth goddess to release a completed human, ensuring that none were removed from gestation prematurely before full development was achieved. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic preserved on 7 tablets discovered at Nineveh and dating to approximately 1200 BC, provides a parallel account of human creation that corroborates and expands upon the Atrahasis narrative. Tablet 6 of the Enuma Elish describes Marduk's decision to create humanity following his victory over Tiamat and his establishment as supreme deity of the Babylonian pantheon. The context for human creation in the Enuma Elish differs from that presented in Atrahasis, with the Babylonian epic placing creation within the framework of cosmic reorganization after Marduk's triumph, rather than as a response to worker rebellion. However, the fundamental purpose for human creation remains identical in both accounts, with Tablet 6 lines 1 through 8 stating explicitly that Marduk proposed creating humans to perform the service of the gods so that the divine beings might be at ease. This consistency across independent textual traditions, separated by centuries, strengthens the interpretation that Mesopotamian civilization maintains stable understanding of human origins and purpose throughout its long history. The Enuma Elish describes how Marduk announced his creation plan to Ea, who was identified with Enki in Babylonian tradition, stating his intention to create a savage man who would be charged with the service of the gods. The term Awilu, translated as man or savage man, carries connotations of primitive or natural state, suggesting the created humans would lack the refinement and capabilities of divine beings while possessing sufficient capacity for productive labour. The text describes how Marduk proposed to concentrate blood and fashion bone to create this new being. With language that parallels the Atrahasis description of mixing divine blood with clay, though the Enuma Elish emphasises the bone structure rather than the clay component, Ea's response to Marduk's proposal receives detailed treatment in Tablet 6 lines 9 through 18 of the Enuma Elish. The text describes how Ea praised Marduk's plan, but suggested an important modification regarding the source material for human creation. Rather than using blood from one of the productive gods who would be needed for ongoing divine operations, Ea proposed selecting a god who bore guilt or responsibility for the recent cosmic conflict to serve as the source of human essence. This proposal solved two problems simultaneously, providing appropriate punishment for rebellion while generating the raw material necessary for creating human workers. The text indicates that Ea's suggestion met with immediate approval from the assembled gods, who recognized the justice and efficiency of this solution. The identification of an appropriate sacrificial god required investigation into the causes of the recent conflict between Marduk and Tiamat, with Tablet 6 describing how the divine assembly held a judicial inquiry to determine who had instigated the rebellion that necessitated Marduk's military intervention. This judicial process paralleled court procedures documented in Mesopotamian legal texts, including the presentation of evidence, examination of witnesses, and formal deliberation before rendering judgment. The emphasis on proper legal procedure for determining the sacrificial victim suggests Mesopotamian understanding viewed even divine actions as subject to principles of justice and due process rather than arbitrary exercise of power. The Enuma Elish identifies the sacrificial god differently than the Atrahasis epic, naming him as Kingu, who had served as Tiamat's champion during the cosmic conflict. Tablet 6 lines 31 through 34 describe how Marduk determined that Kingu possessed the necessary qualities for creating intelligent beings, specifically his ability to conceive of warfare and organize military strategy, which demonstrated advanced cognitive capabilities. The selection of Kingu rather than an arbitrary divine figure emphasized that the human essence would derive from a god who had proven capacity for complex thinking, planning, and leadership, even though these capabilities had been directed toward rebellion rather than constructive purposes. The text describes how Kingu was brought before the divine assembly in chains following his capture during Marduk's victory over Tiamat's forces. The judicial proceedings established King's guilt in fomenting the rebellion by convincing Tiamat to create an army of monsters and launch war against the established divine order. Tablet 6 lines 24 through 30 preserve the verdict pronounced against Kingu, which declared that he had stirred up conflict and encouraged Tiamat's aggression, making him responsible for the chaos and destruction that followed. The punishment decreed for these crimes involved execution with his blood being used for human creation, a sentence that served both retributive and utilitarian purposes by removing a dangerous rebel while providing essential material for the labour replacement program. The text describes King's response to this sentence as stoic acceptance without protest or appeal, suggesting he recognised the justice of the verdict or understood that resistance would be futile. The execution procedure for King described in Tablet 6 lines 31 through 36 of the Enuma Elish involved Ea performing the actual sacrifice, while Marduk supervised and the assembled gods witnessed. The text states that they bound King and held him before Ea, who imposed the punishment and severed his blood vessels. The language used for this execution employs terminology found in Mesopotamian ritual texts, describing proper sacrificial procedures, indicating established protocols were followed rather than arbitrary violence. The collection of King's blood received careful attention in the text, with descriptions of how Ea ensured complete capture of the vital fluid in prepared vessels. The text emphasizes that King possessed particularly potent blood due to his advanced cognitive capabilities and his role as Tiamat's chosen champion, suggesting that the quality of the divine source material directly affected the capabilities of the humans created from it. The Enuma Elish describes how Ea used kings' collected blood to fashion humankind, creating beings who would bear the burden of divine labour. The specific procedure for transforming blood into humans receives less detailed treatment in the Enuma Elish than in the Atrahasis epic, with the Babylonian text focusing more on the judicial and political aspects of selecting the sacrificial god, rather than the technical details of the creation process itself. However, the fundamental concept remains identical between both accounts, with human creation involving the mixing of divine essence with earthly materials to produce beings designed specifically for manual labour. Both the Atrahasis epic and the Enuma Elish explicitly state the purpose for which humanity was created, providing clarity that removes any ambiguity about the utilitarian nature of human origins according to Mesopotamian tradition. Tablet 1, column 15 of the Atrahasis. Epic preserves Enki's declaration of human purpose in terms that demonstrate the pragmatic motivation behind the creation project. The text states that the Lulu, the primitive worker, would bear the yoke of the gods and carry their burden. This explicit statement of purpose appears not in obscure or fragmentary passages subject to interpretive debate, but in clear, unambiguous language that leaves no room for alternative readings. The term translated as yoke employs Sumerian vocabulary associated with agricultural implements and draft animal equipment, specifically the wooden frame placed across the necks or shoulders of oxen to enable them to pull ploughs and wagons. The application of this terminology to human purpose establishes an unmistakable parallel between humans and domesticated work animals, both created or bred specifically to perform labour benefiting their masters. The burden humans would carry encompassed the full range of physical tasks previously performed by the Igigi, including excavation of canals and waterways, transportation of materials across long distances, construction of temples and administrative buildings, cultivation of fields to produce food supplies, and maintenance of infrastructure necessary for divine operations on Earth. The text describes these responsibilities as being transferred from divine shoulders to human ones, with the specific intent that gods would thereafter be free from toil and able to pursue activities appropriate to their superior nature and capabilities. The Enuma Elish presents the identical purpose statement using slightly different language that reinforces rather than contradicts the Atrahasis account. Tablet 6 lines 34 through 36 state that humans were created to be charged with the service of the gods so that the gods might be at ease. The term service in this context derives from Akkadian roots meaning work, labour or compulsory duty, rather than voluntary assistance or worship. The phrase at ease indicates the intended outcome of human creation was divine comfort and freedom from arduous labour, rather than any benefit to humans themselves. This consistency across independent textual traditions dating from different periods of Mesopotamian history demonstrates remarkable stability in cultural memory regarding human origins and purpose. The pragmatic utilitarian motivation for human creation stands in stark contrast to creation narratives from other ancient cultures that typically describe humans as being created in divine image to reflect divine glory, or as offspring of gods deserving inherent dignity and value. The Mesopotamian accounts contain no suggestion that humans possess inherent worth beyond their utility as workers, no indication that gods created humans to enjoy relationship with them, and no implication that human existence serves any cosmic or spiritual purpose transcending practical labour requirements. This brutally honest assessment of human origins as a workforce replacement program, rather than a divinely beloved creation, may explain why these Mesopotamian accounts influenced, but never completely displaced creation narratives in cultures that adopted other theological frameworks emphasizing human dignity and divine-human relationship. The creation accounts make explicit that the work humans would perform was necessary for maintaining divine civilization and operations on Earth, but was considered beneath the dignity of divine beings to perform themselves. Tablet 1, column 16 of the Atrahasis epic describes the categories of work that would be assigned to humans, organised according to specialised functions that required training and supervision. The agricultural labour included ploughing fields, planting crops, maintaining irrigation systems, harvesting produce, and processing food supplies. The construction work encompassed quarrying stone, transporting materials, laying foundations, raising walls, and finishing structures according to divine architectural specifications. The mining operations involved excavating deep shafts, extracting minerals and metals, processing ores through smelting, and refining products to standards required for divine manufacturing needs. The text indicates that different human populations would be trained for different specializations, with some focused primarily on agricultural production, while others concentrated on construction or mining activities. This division of labour among human workers replicated organisational structures documented in Sumerian administrative texts from historical periods, suggesting the creation narratives described implementation of actual workforce management systems rather than presenting purely mythological scenarios. The training procedures for newly created humans received detailed attention in the texts, with descriptions of how divine supervisors would instruct humans in proper techniques for their assigned tasks and establish performance expectations that would govern ongoing operations. Sumerian medical texts and temple inscriptions provide additional details about the physical characteristics that the Anunnaki engineered into the human template. Tablet British Museum No. 4613 contains descriptions of anatomical features that were specifically designed to enable humans to perform manual labour effectively, while maintaining sufficient cognitive capacity for receiving and following instructions. The skeletal structure of humans received particular attention in these design specifications, with the text describing how Enki specified that humans would possess upright bipedal posture, enabling use of hands for tool manipulation, while maintaining stable balance during prolonged standing and walking. The spinal column was designed with appropriate curvature to support upright posture, without causing excessive strain during bending and lifting activities required for manual labour. The pelvic structure was configured to transfer weight efficiently from the spine to the legs, while providing attachment points for powerful leg muscles necessary for sustained walking and lifting heavy loads. The leg bones were specified to be robust enough to support body weight, plus carried loads without fracturing under normal working conditions, with particular attention to the knee joint design that would enable squatting and kneeling positions frequently required during agricultural and construction work. The text describes how the arm and shoulder structure was engineered to provide strength for lifting and carrying, while maintaining the flexibility necessary for wielding tools and manipulating materials with precision. The shoulder joint design received specific mention as requiring particular balance between strength and range of motion, with the text indicating that excessive strength might reduce flexibility, while excessive mobility might compromise lifting capacity. The hand design received extraordinarily detailed specification in the physical design documents, according to Tablet British Museum No. 4613. The text describes how Enki specified that human hands would feature opposing thumbs capable of pressing against the fingers to create secure grips on tools and materials. The finger length and proportions were calculated to enable manipulation of objects ranging from small seeds and grains to large stones and timbers, with sufficient strength in the grip to maintain hold during vigorous work, but enough tactile sensitivity to detect material properties and make fine adjustments. The text indicates that palm width and finger spacing were specified to optimize tool handling, with particular attention to ensuring humans could effectively grip and wield the implements they would use in agricultural construction and mining operations. The presence of fingerprints and palm prints, described in the text as the marks of the makers, were identified as features that would enhance grip on smooth surfaces and enable secure handling of materials in wet or dusty conditions. The fingernails were described as protective covering for sensitive fingertips, while also serving as useful implements for scraping, prying, and detailed manipulation tasks. This level of anatomical specification in ancient texts describing human creation demonstrates sophisticated understanding of biomechanical principles and functional anatomy that correlates remarkably with modern ergonomic engineering that designs human tools and workspaces to optimize performance and minimize injury. The muscular system received comparable detailed attention in the physical specifications according to the texts. Tablet British Museum number 4613 describes how human muscles were designed with specific strength-to-endurance ratios appropriate for sustained labour rather than brief explosive effort. The leg muscles were specified to provide sufficient strength for walking long distances while carrying loads and for maintaining standing positions during extended work periods. The back muscles received special attention due to their crucial role in lifting and carrying, with the text describing how these muscle groups were designed to work in coordination to support spinal column function and prevent injury during manual labour. The arm and shoulder muscles were specified to enable repetitive motions required for tool use, including chopping, digging, hammering, and carrying without rapid fatigue. The text indicates that human muscle tissue was designed to recover relatively quickly from exertion through short rest periods, enabling work to continue with only brief interruptions rather than requiring extended recovery times that would reduce productivity. The cardiovascular system specifications addressed the need for sustained physical activity by designing heart and blood vessel systems capable of delivering oxygen and nutrients to working muscles efficiently during prolonged labour. The respiratory system was specified to provide adequate air intake during physical exertion, while remaining efficient enough not to require excessive rest to recover from moderate activity levels. The sensory systems engineered into humans received specification according to their utility for work performance, rather than for aesthetic appreciation or abstract perception. The visual system was designed to provide accurate depth perception necessary for manual work, colour discrimination sufficient to identify materials and assess ripeness of crops, and visual acuity adequate for detailed manipulation tasks. The text describes how human vision was specified to function effectively in bright sunlight, necessary for outdoor agricultural and construction work, while maintaining sufficient dark adaptation for indoor and underground mining operations. The hearing system was designed to enable humans to receive verbal instructions from supervisors and to detect warning sounds of potential dangers in work environments. The tactile sense received particular emphasis in the design specifications, with the text describing how human skin sensitivity was calibrated to detect temperature, texture, and pressure with sufficient precision to enable safe and effective handling of materials and tools. The sense of smell was specified to help humans identify spoiled food, detect harmful substances, and assess soil quality for agricultural purposes. The sense of taste enabled humans to select appropriate foods and avoid consuming toxic substances that might impair their ability to work. The integration of these sensory systems with cognitive processing capabilities enabled humans to gather environmental information and respond appropriately to changing work conditions without requiring constant direct supervision. The creation accounts emphasize that human intelligence was deliberately calibrated to serve the intended purpose, without exceeding levels that might pose challenges to divine authority. Tablet 2, Column 3 of the Atrahasis epic describes how Nintu and Enki carefully measured the amount of divine essence mixed into the clay to produce beings who possessed sufficient cognitive capacity for complex tasks but remained within manageable parameters. The text employs mathematical terminology to describe this calibration process, indicating that precise ratios were calculated to achieve optimal intelligence levels. The cognitive capabilities humans required for effective labour included the ability to comprehend verbal and demonstrated instructions, capacity to remember learned procedures and apply them consistently, capability to recognise patterns and anticipate sequential steps in complex tasks, and sufficient reasoning ability to solve routine problems without requiring supervisor intervention for every minor difficulty. The text describes how Enki specified that humans should possess language capabilities, enabling them to receive instructions, communicate about work-related matters with supervisors and other workers, and transmit learned techniques to subsequent generations through teaching. The memory capacity was specified to enable retention of detailed procedures involving multiple steps and complex sequences, while not extending to perfect recall that might enable humans to accumulate too much knowledge or maintain grievances across extended time periods. The reasoning abilities were calibrated to permit logical thinking about immediate practical problems, while limiting abstract reasoning capacity that might lead to questioning of the established order or philosophical speculation about the justice of human subordination to divine authority. The intelligence limitations built into the human template manifested in several specific ways, according to the creation accounts. Tablet 2, Column 4 describes how human lifespans were intentionally limited so that no individual could accumulate excessive knowledge or develop dangerous levels of expertise that might challenge divine monopolies on advanced technical knowledge. The text indicates that by restricting human lifespans to a few decades, rather than the centuries or millennia of divine existence, the Anunnaki ensured that each generation of humans would need to relearn essential techniques, preventing the build-up of knowledge capital that might enable humans to function independently of divine guidance. The cognitive processing speed of humans was specified to be substantially slower than divine mental capabilities, meaning humans required more time to learn new skills and solve complex problems, maintaining permanent dependence on divine instruction for any activities beyond routine repetitive labour. The creativity and innovation capabilities of humans were limited by restrictions on abstract reasoning, reducing the likelihood that humans would develop new technologies or techniques without divine authorization and supervision. The text describes how these intelligence limitations serve the dual purpose of maintaining human utility for labour, while preventing humans from developing capabilities that might enable them to challenge divine authority or operate independently of divine control. The balance between sufficient intelligence for complex labour and restricted intelligence preventing independence required careful calibration according to the creation accounts, with the text suggesting this represented one of the most challenging aspects of human design. The texts indicate that monitoring human intelligence levels remained an ongoing concern for the Anunnaki after creation, with provisions for adjusting human capabilities if they demonstrated either insufficient intelligence for assigned tasks or excessive intelligence approaching dangerous levels. Tablet 2, Column 5 of the Atrahasis epic, describes how divine observers maintained surveillance over human populations to detect any signs of cognitive development exceeding designed parameters. The text mentions that humans who displayed exceptional intelligence or innovation capabilities were sometimes removed from general populations and brought into closer divine supervision where their abilities could be controlled and directed toward approved purposes. This selective management of human intelligence maintained the overall population at intended cognitive levels, while exploiting any useful anomalies that emerge through the genetic variation inherent in biological reproduction. The creation of writing systems received explicit divine authorization according to Sumerian literary texts, with the gift of literacy being portrayed as a divine grant rather than a human invention. This controlled release of advanced cognitive tools enabled humans to maintain administrative records and preserve technical knowledge necessary for complex operations, while the divine monopoly on literacy instruction ensured that reading and writing remained restricted to Scrabble classes under direct divine supervision. The mathematical knowledge available to humans similarly remained under divine control, with basic arithmetic sufficient for practical measurements being widely taught, while advanced mathematical concepts necessary for engineering and astronomical calculations remained restricted to specialized temple schools where instruction occurred under priestly supervision that maintained divine oversight. The Mesopotamian creation narratives explicitly address human mortality as an engineered feature rather than a punishment for transgression. The Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved on 12 tablets discovered at Nineveh and dating to approximately 1300 BC, contains passages that describe mortality as a defining characteristic built into the human template from the moment of creation. Tablet 10 of the Gilgamesh epic preserves the conversation between Gilgamesh and the alewife Siduri, in which she explains that when the gods created humanity, they allotted death to mankind but retained life in their own hands. This explicit statement that mortality was assigned to humans at creation, rather than imposed subsequently as punishment for disobedience, corresponds precisely with the creation accounts in the Atrahasis epic and Enuma Elish, which describe mortality as one of the engineered characteristics distinguishing humans from divine beings. The purpose of human mortality extended beyond simple biological limitation to serve multiple functions in managing the human workforce, according to these ancient accounts. The limited lifespan ensured that humans remained focused on immediate survival needs and practical work rather than accumulating resources or developing long-term plans that might conflict with divine interests. The text describes mortality as preventing humans from gaining excessive experience or knowledge that might enable them to challenge divine authority or operate independently of divine control. The regular replacement of aging workers with young, strong labourers through generational succession maintained workforce productivity without requiring divine intervention to remove worn-out workers or manage retirement populations no longer capable of useful labour. The biological mechanisms of aging and death receive description in Sumerian medical texts that parallel the creation account emphasis on mortality as an engineered feature. Tablet British Museum No. 47219 contains descriptions of how human bodies gradually deteriorate through accumulated damage and declining repair capabilities, processes described as having been built into human biology from the beginning rather than representing disease or malfunction. The text describes how cellular regeneration capacities diminish with age, causing tissues to lose flexibility and strength, organs to decline in function, and systems to become progressively less able to maintain health and resist disease. This understanding of aging as programmed deterioration rather than environmental damage corresponds to modern biological concepts of cellular senescence and programmed cell death, suggesting the Mesopotamian accounts preserved sophisticated knowledge of biological aging mechanisms. The average human lifespan after the flood was described in various Mesopotamian texts as being approximately 70 to 80 years, a duration considered optimal for maintaining useful labour productivity across most of the adult life, while ensuring regular workforce replacement through generational turnover. The text indicates that humans who survive to advanced age typically experience declining strength and capability that reduce their labour value, making natural death through aging a more efficient workforce management tool than requiring divine intervention to remove unproductive workers. The contrast between human mortality and divine immortality served to reinforce the fundamental distinction between the created workforce and their creator employers according to the texts. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes Gilgamesh's quest for immortality following the death of his companion Enkidu, with the narrative emphasizing repeatedly that immortality remains the exclusive possession of the gods and cannot be obtained by humans regardless of their heroic achievements or exceptional qualities. Tablet 11 describes how Gilgamesh travelled to visit Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who had been granted immortality by the gods as an exceptional reward, seeking to learn the secret of eternal life. The conversation between Gilgamesh and Utnapishtim, preserved in Tablet 11 columns 1 through 20, emphasizes that Utnapishtim's immortality resulted from a unique circumstance that would never be repeated, with the gods having decreed that no other human would receive similar treatment. This narrative reinforced the theological position that human mortality was permanent and unchangeable, serving divine purposes that would be undermined if humans could somehow escape their design limitations. The text describes how Gilgamesh eventually accepted the impossibility of obtaining immortality and returned to Uruk resigned to his mortal fate, with the epic concluding that humans should focus on accomplishing what they can during their limited lifespans rather than wasting time seeking the unattainable goal of escaping death. The creation accounts include detailed descriptions of reproductive capabilities that were engineered into the human template to ensure population sustainability. Tablet 2 columns 8 through 10 of the Atrahasis epic describe how Nintu established the protocols for human reproduction, including conception cycles, gestation periods, and birth procedures that would enable rapid population growth. The text indicates that human reproduction was designed to be substantially more efficient than divine reproduction, enabling human populations to expand rapidly enough to meet ongoing labour requirements without requiring repeated divine creation efforts. The fertility specifications included relatively short gestation periods of 10 months compared to much longer development times for divine offspring, frequent conception cycles enabling women to bear multiple children during their reproductive years, and high survival rates for offspring who received adequate nutrition and care. The text describes how Nintu established that human females would experience monthly fertility cycles, enabling conception during specific windows of opportunity that occurred repeatedly throughout the year. This frequent fertility differed from divine reproduction, which the texts describe as occurring rarely and requiring special conditions, making human self-replication through natural reproduction far more efficient for maintaining workforce populations. The specifications included multiple offspring capability, with the text describing human females as capable of bearing and nursing several children to maturity during their reproductive years, enabling exponential population growth when conditions supported child survival. The birth process received detailed technical description in Tablet 2 columns 9 and 10, with the text explaining how Nintu established specific procedures and stages for human childbirth that would enable successful delivery without requiring divine intervention for each birth. The text describes the progression of pregnancy through recognizable stages marked by physical changes in the mother's body, the onset of labor through contractions that would expel the infant from the womb, and the postnatal care procedures necessary to ensure infant survival, including nursing for nourishment and protection from environmental threats. The creation accounts emphasize that while divine assistance might be invoked for difficult births, the normal human reproductive process was designed to function autonomously without requiring constant divine supervision or intervention. This self-sustaining reproductive capability represented one of the key engineering achievements in human design, according to the texts, enabling human populations to maintain and expand themselves through natural processes rather than requiring ongoing divine creation efforts. The text indicates that Nintu established the role of midwives among human females, with experienced women assisting others during childbirth and transmitting essential knowledge about pregnancy and infant care across generations. This institutionalization of birth assistance within human communities ensured successful reproduction rates while maintaining the pattern of humans helping humans under initial divine guidance that would later enable autonomous function. The Sumerian king list, preserved on multiple tablets including the Weld-Blundell Prism housed in the Ashmolean Museum and dating to approximately 2000 BC, provides chronological context for the creation narratives by describing the period before humans existed when the Anunnaki themselves performed all necessary labour. The king list represents one of the most important chronological documents from ancient Mesopotamia, cataloguing the rulers of Sumerian city-states from the earliest periods through the Isin dynasty around 1900 BC. The document's significance for understanding human creation narratives lies in its explicit division of history into two distinct periods separated by the Great Flood, with the antediluvian section describing extraordinarily long reigns that correlate with the period when divine beings rule directly without human intermediaries. The opening lines of the king list preserved on the Weld-Blundell Prism state that after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, establishing divine origin for royal authority and identifying Eridu as the first city to receive organised governance. The text then lists 8 kings who ruled before the flood, assigning them reigns of extraordinary duration measured in thousands of years. Alulim, the first king at Eridu, ruled for 28,800 years according to the list, followed by Elalangar, who ruled for 36,000 years. These impossibly long reigns have been interpreted by conventional scholarship as mythological exaggeration, or as representing dynasties rather than individual rulers. But when examined alongside the creation narratives, they take on different significance as potentially describing the extended period during which the Anunnaki established and maintained their operations on Earth before creating humans to assume labour responsibilities. The chronological framework provided by the king list indicates that Anunnaki direct rule without human assistance continued for hundreds of thousands of years, according to the mathematical totals preserved in the text. The combined reigns of the 8 antediluvian kings total 241,200 years, representing the duration of the period when divine beings performed all necessary work themselves before the Igigi rebellion forced creation of human workers. This extended time frame correlates with the Atrahasis epic's description of the Igigi labouring for 40 years before their rebellion, if the term years in that context represents something other than standard solar years. Mesopotamian mathematical texts demonstrate sophisticated understanding of different time measurement systems and the ability to convert between various scales, suggesting the chronological references in these ancient texts may employ units requiring conversion to understand their actual duration. The king list transition from divine to human rulers after the flood corresponds precisely with the creation narrative time frame, indicating that human populations had expanded sufficiently by the post-Diluvian period to provide adequate labour forces that eliminated the need for Anunnaki to perform manual work or rule cities directly. The post-flood section of the king list shows dramatically reduced reign lengths, with rulers governing for decades or centuries rather than tens of thousands of years, suggesting a fundamental change in the nature of kingship from direct divine rule to human governance under divine supervision. The archaeological context supporting the king list's historical reliability includes the verification of many post-flood rulers through contemporary inscriptions and administrative documents that confirm their existence and approximate reign lengths. Excavations at Ur, Uruk, Kish, and other sites mentioned in the king list have uncovered royal inscriptions, administrative tablets, and architectural remains that corroborate the document's testimony about specific rulers and their construction projects. This archaeological confirmation of later entries in the king list strengthens the credibility of earlier sections that cannot be verified through independent sources, suggesting the entire document represents genuine historical tradition rather than literary invention. The consistency of the king list across multiple copies found at different sites and dating to different periods demonstrates remarkable stability in the chronological tradition, with variations between copies being minor and typically involving spelling differences or textual errors, rather than substantial disagreements about content or sequence. Thorkild Jakobsen's comprehensive analysis of the king list, published in 1939, established its reliability as a historical source, while acknowledging the interpretive challenges posed by the antediluvian section's extraordinary chronology. The document's matter-of-fact presentation of both antediluvian and post-diluvian rulers, without any indication that the two periods should be understood differently, suggests ancient Mesopotamians viewed the entire chronology as representing actual historical sequence rather than mixing mythological and historical materials. Following the successful creation of the first humans, the Atrahasis epic describes a period of rapid population growth that fulfilled the Anunnaki's labour requirements, but eventually created new challenges. Tablet 2 columns 15 through 20 describe how human populations expanded across Mesopotamia over several centuries, with each generation receiving training in specialised tasks. The text indicates that the initial 14 humans created through the womb house procedure produced offspring who inherited their parents' physical capabilities and cognitive capacities, enabling the second generation to perform the same labour functions without requiring additional divine creation efforts. The reproductive success of early humans exceeded the Anunnaki's initial projections according to the text, with human populations doubling every generation as the newly created beings proved highly fertile and their offspring survived to reproductive age at rates higher than anticipated. The text describes how human settlements spread from the original creation site throughout the river valleys of southern Mesopotamia, with divine overseers directing population movements to areas where labour was needed for agricultural development, construction projects, and mining operations. The expansion proceeded systematically according to the text, with the Anunnaki establishing new settlements and assigning human populations to each location based on labour requirements and resource availability. The training systems established for human workers ensured that essential skills would be transmitted across generations through apprenticeship models where experienced workers taught younger generations the techniques necessary for their assigned tasks. The agricultural training programs described in the text included instruction in soil preparation through ploughing, seed selection, and planting techniques, irrigation system maintenance and operation, crop monitoring and pest management, harvesting procedures and timing, and food storage and preservation methods. The text indicates that divine agricultural specialists supervise this training initially, demonstrating proper techniques and establishing standards for work quality that humans were expected to maintain. As human populations grew and gained experience, the training responsibility shifted gradually from divine instructors to experienced human workers who had mastered the required skills through years of practice. This transition from divine to human instruction represented an important development that reduced the supervisory burden on the Anunnaki, while ensuring that agricultural knowledge would be preserved and transmitted within human communities. The construction training followed similar patterns, with divine architects and engineers initially providing detailed instruction in quarrying stone, shaping blocks to specified dimensions, transporting materials using sledges and rollers, laying foundations according to surveyed plans, raising walls using proper bonding patterns, and finishing structures with precision alignments. The text describes how construction projects during the early human period required intensive divine supervision to ensure humans followed specifications correctly and achieved the quality standards expected for divine buildings and infrastructure. The gradual development of skilled human craftsmen who could execute complex construction projects with minimal oversight represented successful achievement of one of the primary goals of human creation, freeing divine engineers to focus on design and planning rather than hands-on building activities. The mining operations received particular attention in the text's description of human workforce development, as extraction of minerals and metals represented one of the primary motivations for establishing Anunnaki operations on Earth, according to the creation narratives. The text describes specialized training programs for miners that included techniques for identifying ore deposits through surface indicators and test excavations, excavating shafts and tunnels using proper support structures to prevent collapse, extracting ore while minimizing waste rock, transporting materials from underground workings to surface processing areas, and basic ore processing to separate valuable minerals from waste materials. The text indicates that mining operations required the most intensive ongoing divine supervision due to the technical complexity and inherent dangers of underground work. Human miners needed to understand geological principles to follow ore veins efficiently, engineering concepts to maintain safe tunnel structures, and metallurgical basics to identify valuable materials and assess ore quality. The text describes how the Anunnaki maintained permanent supervisory presence at major mining operations throughout the early human period, with divine overseers directing excavation activities and managing the processing of extracted materials. The development of hereditary mining communities where skills and knowledge passed from parents to children created stable workforces capable of maintaining operations with reduced divine oversight. Though the text indicates that divine supervisors never completely withdrew from mining operations due to their critical importance for Anunnaki objectives on Earth. The Atrahasis epic introduces a subsequent crisis that arose from the very success of human population expansion. Tablet 2, column 21, describes how the increasing human population created disturbances that affected the Anunnaki's operations and quality of life. The text uses the term rigmu, which translates as noise or uproar, to describe the cumulative effect of human activities. The concept of rigmu in Mesopotamian literature encompasses more than simple auditory noise to include broader disruption, disturbance, and the general commotion created by large populations engaged in diverse activities. The text describes how the growing human population generated increasing levels of rigmu through their labour activities, domestic life, social interactions, and sheer numbers occupying the landscape. The specific complaints about human rigmu preserved in the text include the constant sounds of human voices talking, laughing, arguing, and conducting business, the noise of construction activities including hammering, sawing, and stone cutting, the disturbances from agricultural work including the sounds of animals and equipment, the clamour of mining operations and metal processing, and the general bustle of expanding settlements with their markets, workshops, and residential areas. The text indicates that human settlements had proliferated to the point where divine residences that had previously enjoyed peaceful isolation were now surrounded by noisy human communities whose activities created constant background disturbance. The rigmu problem intensified as human populations continued to grow and their settlements expanded geographically according to Tablet 2 columns 21 through 24. The text describes how Enlil found the increasing human noise particularly disturbing, interfering with his rest and making it difficult for him to concentrate on administrative responsibilities. The language used in the text suggests that rigmu represented more than mere inconvenience to describe something approaching physical distress, caused by constant exposure to noise and activity. The text indicates that Enlil raised the rigmu issue at divine council meetings, complaining that human populations had become excessive and that their noise was making life intolerable for the Anunnaki who had created humans specifically to make divine existence more comfortable rather than less so. The irony of this situation received implicit recognition in the text through its description of how the solution to the Igigi labour crisis had generated a new crisis of overpopulation and environmental disturbance. The text describes how other Anunnaki shared Enlil's concerns about human rigmu to varying degrees, with some finding the noise merely annoying while others considered it a serious problem requiring intervention. The debate within the Divine Council about how to address the rigmu crisis revealed fundamental disagreements about human management and the appropriate relationship between creators and created beings, with these disagreements setting the stage for the conflicts that would eventually culminate in the flood. The noise crisis led Enlil to implement a series of population reduction measures that the Atrahasis epic describes in systematic detail. Tablet 2, columns 25 through 35 documents Enlil's authorization of plague, drought, and famine as methods to reduce human numbers to more manageable levels. These population control measures were not presented as divine anger or moral judgment, but as practical resource management. The text describes how Enlil proposed his population reduction plan to the Divine Council as a rational response to an environmental and operational problem caused by excessive human numbers. The first measure implemented involved the release of plague among human populations, with the text describing how Enlil authorized Namtar, the divine figure associated with disease and death, to spread illness through human communities. The plague appeared suddenly in multiple locations according to the text, causing high mortality rates that substantially reduced human populations within a relatively short period. The text describes symptoms of the plague including fever, weakness, skin lesions, and respiratory distress that led to death within days of infection onset. The medical descriptions preserved in the text correlate with known epidemic diseases that affected ancient Mesopotamian populations, suggesting the narrative drew from actual historical experiences with plague outbreaks, rather than purely imaginative scenarios. The duration of the plague and its demographic impact receive specific mention in Tablet 2 columns 26 through 28. The text indicates that the disease persisted for 6 years, creating sustained population decline that reversed several generations of growth and reduced human numbers to levels that significantly decreased Rigmu disturbance. The text describes how the plague affected primarily urban settlements, where population density facilitated disease transmission, while rural agricultural communities experienced lower mortality rates due to their dispersed settlement patterns. This differential impact meant that agricultural production continued at reasonable levels despite population decline, ensuring that the Anunnaki food supply chain remained functional even as the human workforce diminished. The text indicates that Enlil monitored the plague's progress with satisfaction, noting that reduced human populations generated substantially less noise, and that the survivors appeared more subdued and manageable than previous generations, who had grown accustomed to increasing numbers and expanding territory. However, the text describes how human populations began recovering within a generation after the plague ended, with fertility rates among survivors producing rapid population growth that threatened to restore human numbers to pre-plague levels within a few decades. This resilience of human populations frustrated Enlil's population control objectives and led him to implement additional measures designed to create more sustained demographic pressure. The second population reduction measure involved creating drought conditions that would reduce agricultural productivity and generate famine according to Tablet 2 columns 29 through 31. The text describes how Enlil commanded Adad, the divine figure responsible for weather and precipitation, to withhold rain from human agricultural regions. The drought began gradually with reduced rainfall that initially caused crop stress but not complete failure, then intensified over subsequent seasons until virtually no rain fell in affected areas. The text describes how human farmers attempted to compensate for reduced rainfall by expanding irrigation from rivers and canals, but the text indicates that water levels in the rivers also declined as drought conditions persisted, making irrigation increasingly difficult. The agricultural crisis generated by the drought created food shortages that escalated into widespread famine as stored grain supplies depleted and new crops failed. The text describes how famine affected human populations more gradually than plague, but ultimately proved more devastating due to its sustained duration and comprehensive impact. The mortality rates from starvation and related diseases eliminated substantial portions of human populations according to the text, with the most vulnerable, including children, elderly, and those already weakened by disease or overwork, dying first. The text indicates that the famine persisted for 7 years, creating demographic catastrophe that reduced human populations to levels not seen since the earliest generations after creation. Throughout the population reduction attempts, Enki consistently intervened to protect humanity and provide solutions that would mitigate the severity of Enlil's measures. Tablet 3 columns 1 through 10 describe how Enki secretly communicated with selected humans, particularly Atrahasis, whose name means exceedingly wise, providing advance warning of impending disasters and instructions for survival. The text establishes Atrahasis as a particularly intelligent and capable human who had distinguished himself through his problem-solving abilities and his devotion to Enki as patron deity. The relationship between Enki and Atrahasis paralleled the special connection Enki maintained with humanity in general, viewing his creation project with protective concern rather than the utilitarian indifference that characterized Enlil's attitude toward human workers. The text describes how Enki approached Atrahasis secretly to avoid detection by Enlil and other Anunnaki who supported the population reduction program, using a communication method that involves speaking through walls or other barriers that technically avoided face-to-face contact, prohibited by council agreements. The specific technique Enki employed involved speaking to a reed wall or fence surrounding Atrahasis' house, with the word passing through the barrier to reach Atrahasis on the other side. This indirect communication method satisfied the letter of agreements prohibiting direct divine-human contact, while enabling Enki to convey essential information and instructions to his human ally. The instructions Enki provided to Atrahasis during the plague outbreak focused on medical interventions that would reduce infection transmission and treat symptoms according to Tablet 3 columns 2 and 3. The text describes how Enki advised Atrahasis to organize human communities to isolate sick individuals from healthy populations, maintain clean water supplies separated from contaminated sources, dispose of bodies in ways that prevented disease spread, and use specific plant medicines that would reduce fever and strengthen resistance to infection. The text indicates that Atrahasis implemented these instructions within his own community and shared them with leaders of other settlements, creating coordinated public health responses that reduced plague mortality compared to communities that lacked such guidance. The effectiveness of these interventions attracted attention from divine observers who noted that certain human communities survived the plague with lower mortality rates than expected, though the text indicates that Enlil attributed this to natural variation rather than suspecting deliberate intervention by Enki. The text describes how human populations that followed Enki's instructions preserved substantial numbers through the plague period and were positioned to recover more quickly when the disease finally subsided, maintaining population levels adequate for essential labour, while avoiding the complete devastation Enlil had intended. During the drought and famine period, Enki provided Atrahasis with different types of assistance focused on maintaining food production, despite adverse conditions according to Tablet 3 columns 4 through 7. The text describes how Enki instructed Atrahasis to organize fishing expeditions that exploited aquatic resources not dependent on rainfall or agricultural production. The text indicates that Enki specifically directed human attention to the resources of rivers, marshes and coastal waters where fish, waterfowl and edible plants could supplement or replace grain-based diets. The instructions included techniques for fishing using nets and traps, methods for catching birds, and identification of edible marsh plants that could be harvested even during drought conditions. The text describes how Atrahasis again shared these survival strategies with other human communities, creating networks of food exchange that enabled populations to survive despite agricultural collapse. The text indicates that Enki also provided instruction on water conservation and irrigation efficiency, teaching humans to maximize agricultural output from limited water supplies through careful management and optimal crop selection. These interventions enabled human populations to maintain sufficient numbers through the famine period to prevent labor force collapse while avoiding the population elimination Enlil sought through his drought measures. The culmination of Enlil's population control efforts involved the implementation of a global flood designed to eliminate humanity entirely and resolve the noise problem permanently. Tablet 3 columns 15 through 25 describe the Divine Council meeting where Enlil proposed this final solution, extracting oaths from the other Anunnaki not to warn humanity of the impending catastrophe. The text indicates that Enlil had become increasingly frustrated by human resilience in recovering from plague and famine, with populations rebounding to problematic levels within generations despite the severity of the reduction measures implemented. The Rigmu disturbance returned to intolerable levels according to Enlil's assessment, with human noise and activity once again interfering with divine operations and quality of life. The text describes how Enlil presented his flood proposal to the assembled Anunnaki as the definitive solution to the human problem, arguing that partial population reduction measures had proven inadequate, and that only complete elimination of humanity would permanently resolve the crisis. The proposal involved manipulating natural hydrological systems to generate unprecedented flooding that would cover all human settlements and eliminate the entire human population in a single catastrophic event. The text indicates that Enlil's plan included not just the destruction of humans, but also the elimination of livestock and other animals associated with human civilization, creating a comprehensive reset that would erase all traces of the failed human creation experiment. The Divine Council members received Enlil's proposal with mixed reactions according to the text, with some expressing concern about losing the labour force that humans provided, while others supported Enlil's argument that human problems outweighed their benefits. The debate within the Divine Council revealed fundamental philosophical differences about the appropriate relationship between creators and created beings, according to Tablet 3 columns 16 through 19. Those supporting Enlil's position argued that creators possessed absolute authority over their creations and that failed experiments should be terminated rather than endlessly managed. The text preserves arguments emphasizing that the Anunnaki had invested substantial resources in human creation and management, and that continued problems with human populations represented poor return on investment that justified abandoning the project entirely. The supporters of flood implementation noted that the Igigi labour shortage that had originally motivated human creation had been resolved through alternative arrangements, including the assignment of some Igigi to less onerous duties, and the implementation of improved work schedules that reduce the burden on divine workers. The text indicates these arguments persuaded council members who had been uncertain about the flood proposal, creating majority support for Enlil's plan. However, Enki maintained consistent opposition to human elimination according to the text, arguing that the problems with human populations resulted from inadequate management, rather than fundamental flaws in human design. The text preserves Enki's argument that humans had successfully fulfilled their intended purpose of providing labour for divine operations and that their population growth represented success rather than failure of the creation project. Enki proposed alternative management strategies including improved supervision, better urban planning to separate human settlements from divine residences, and implementation of sustainable population control measures that would maintain optimal workforce numbers without requiring complete elimination. Despite Enki's objections, the Divine Council voted to approve Enlil's flood proposal according to Tablet 3 columns 19 through 21. The text describes how Enlil, having secured majority support, demanded that all council members take binding oaths not to warn humans of the impending disaster. This oath requirement served to prevent interventions that might enable human survival, and thereby defeat the purpose of implementing the flood. The text describes the oath ceremony in detail, with each Anunnaki member present speaking specific words, pledging not to reveal the flood plan to humans, or to provide assistance that might enable human survival. The language of the oath was carefully constructed to close obvious loopholes that might permit indirect warnings or assistance according to the text. The oath specifically prohibited speaking directly to humans about the flood, providing tools or materials humans might use for protection, or offering advice about surviving water catastrophes. The text indicates that Enki took the required oath, along with other council members despite his opposition to the flood plan, creating a legal and religious obligation that would constrain his options for protecting humanity. The binding nature of oaths among the Anunnaki receives emphasis in multiple Mesopotamian texts, with oath violation considered one of the most serious offences carrying severe consequences for violators. The text describes how Enlil watched Enki carefully during the oath ceremony. Apparently aware of Enki's protective attitude toward humans, and concerned that the wisdom god might seek ways to undermine the flood implementation. The technical implementation of the flood involved manipulation of natural systems rather than purely supernatural intervention according to the text. Tablet 3 columns 22 through 25 describe how Enlil coordinated with other Anunnaki, who controlled various aspects of weather and water systems to generate the conditions necessary for catastrophic flooding. The text indicates that a dad was assigned responsibility for generating unprecedented rainfall that would provide the primary water source for the flood. The instructions given to Adad specified that rainfall should exceed normal precipitation by orders of magnitude, continuing for extended periods without interruption. The text describes how underground water sources would also contribute to the flood through the breaking up of the fountains of the deep, a phrase suggesting the release of subterranean water reservoirs that normally remained sealed. The coordination of surface rainfall with underground water release would generate flood conditions exceeding anything possible through either mechanism alone, according to the text. The timing of the flood received careful specification, with Enlil establishing a schedule that would catch human populations unprepared and maximize mortality. The text indicates that the flood was set to begin during the agricultural season, when human populations were dispersed across fields and settlements rather than concentrated in locations where they might more easily seek high ground or construct emergency shelters. Despite his oath, Enki found a technical workaround that allowed him to preserve human civilization through the flood. Tablet 3 columns 30 through 40 describe how Enki communicated with Atrahasis through the medium of a reed wall, technically avoiding direct violation of his oath while providing detailed instructions for constructing a survival vessel. The text describes how Enki approached the reed fence surrounding Atrahasis' residence and spoke his warning to the wall itself rather than directly to Atrahasis, who was inside the dwelling. This indirect communication method satisfied the letter of the oath, prohibiting speaking directly to humans, while enabling Enki to convey essential information to his chosen survivor. The text preserves the exact words Enki spoke to the wall, which included explicit acknowledgement of the oath requirement and the technical workaround being employed. Enki addressed the wall with instructions that it should allow his words to pass through to Atrahasis on the other side, creating a chain of communication that placed the wall as intermediary between divine speaker and human listener. The text indicates that Atrahasis understood the situation immediately and recognized both the genuine nature of the warning and the legal constraints forcing Enki to communicate indirectly. The warning included specific information about the flood's timing, its intended comprehensive destruction of humanity, and the necessity of constructing a survival vessel large enough to preserve not just Atrahasis and his family, but also representative animals and essential supplies. The construction specifications for the survival vessel received extraordinary detailed treatment in Tablet 3 columns 31 through 37. The text describes how Enki provided Atrahasis with precise dimensions, materials requirements, and construction techniques necessary to build a craft capable of surviving the catastrophic flood conditions. The vessel specifications included length of 120 cubits, width of 120 cubits, and height of 120 cubits, creating a cube-shaped craft rather than a traditional boat design. The choice of cubic proportions receives no explanation in the text, but suggest engineering calculations optimized for stability in turbulent flood conditions rather than conventional navigation requirements. The text indicates that the vessel should be constructed from wood, specifically mentioning types of timber known for strength and water resistance, including cedar and pine. The instructions specified that all seams and joints must be sealed, with bitumen applied in multiple layers to ensure complete waterproofing. The text provides detailed specifications for the bitumen application process, including the thickness of each layer, the overlap requirements at joints, and the need to allow adequate drying time between layers to ensure proper adhesion and sealing. The internal structure of the vessel received comparable attention in the instructions, with the text describing how the interior should be divided into multiple decks and compartments that would serve different purposes during the voyage. The compartmentalization scheme described in the text included separate areas for human habitation, animal housing organized by species and size, storage of food supplies and fresh water, and seed preservation for agricultural reconstruction after the flood. The text indicates that Enki specified that the vessel should include 7 decks, each divided into 9 compartments, creating 63 distinct spaces within the craft. This elaborate internal structure would enable systematic organization of passengers, animals, and supplies according to the text, while also providing structural reinforcement that enhanced the vessel's ability to withstand external stresses during the flood. The ventilation system specifications included shafts running vertically through the decks to allow air circulation while preventing water entry, with covers that could be sealed during peak storm conditions and opened during calmer periods to refresh interior air. The text describes how the vessel should include a single door for entry and exit positioned high enough above the base to prevent water infiltration during moderate flooding but accessible when the craft rested on solid ground. The roofing system received particular attention, with specifications calling for multiple overlapping layers that would shed water effectively while maintaining structural integrity under the weight of accumulated precipitation and debris. The text indicates that construction should begin immediately upon receiving the instructions and should proceed with maximum speed, as the flood timing was imminent and inadequate preparation time could result in incomplete protection. The gathering of animals and supplies according to the instructions occupied Atrahasis and his family for the period between receiving the warning and the flood's onset, according to Tablet 3 columns 38 through 40. The text describes how Atrahasis explained to his family that they needed to preserve representative animals of all types to enable restoration of animal populations after the flood passed. The selection criteria emphasized breeding pairs of each animal species, with priority given to domesticated animals essential for human agriculture and food production. The text indicates that wild animals were also collected in limited numbers to maintain ecosystem diversity that would be necessary for long-term environmental recovery. The food supply gathering focused on preserved and dried foods capable of lasting extended periods without spoilage, including grain stored in sealed containers, dried meat and fish, preserved fruits, and oil stored in jars. The text describes how the family worked continuously to gather and load supplies, working against the deadline of the flood's arrival and uncertain exactly how long they would need to survive within the sealed vessel. The water supply requirements received careful attention, with the text describing collection of fresh water in large storage vessels that would provide drinking water for humans and animals throughout the flood period. The text indicates that Atrahasis constructed the vessel precisely according to Enki's specifications, completing the work just before the onset of flood conditions. Following the flood subsidence and humanity's survival, through Atrahasis's preparations, the Anunnaki Council determined that biological modifications to the human template were necessary to prevent future population crises. Tablet 3 columns 45 through 50 describe how Nintu implemented changes to human reproductive capabilities that would limit population growth rates. The text describes the discovery of the surviving vessel by Anunnaki observers shortly after floodwaters began receding, with initial reports reaching Enlil causing him considerable distress according to the text. Enlil immediately suspected that Enki had violated his oath by warning humans and enabling survival preparations, leading to angry confrontation between the two deities documented in Tablet 3 columns 41 through 44. The text describes how Enki defended his actions by explaining the technical workaround he had employed, arguing that he had not spoken directly to any human and therefore had not violated the literal terms of his oath. This legalistic defense satisfied the formal requirements of oath compliance according to the text, while obviously undermining the spirit and intent of the agreement. The confrontation between Enlil and Enki revealed the depth of their disagreement about human value and appropriate management, with Enlil viewing human survival as frustrating his legitimate authority, while Enki portrayed preservation of his creation as fulfilling his responsibilities as designer of the human template. The text indicates that other Anunnaki members intervened to prevent the dispute from escalating into serious conflict. proposing compromise solutions that would address both deities' concerns. The compromise negotiated within the Divine Council accepted human survival as an established fact that could not be reversed without implementing another catastrophic elimination effort that would require similarly elaborate preparations and would likely face similar sabotage from Enki. However, the Council insisted that modifications to human capabilities were necessary to prevent the population growth that had generated the noise crisis leading to the flood decision. The text describes how Nintu was assigned responsibility for implementing biological modifications that would reduce human fertility and population growth rates to sustainable levels. The modifications would not eliminate human reproduction entirely, as that would defeat the purpose of maintaining human labour capacity, but would slow population expansion enough to prevent the rapid growth that had overwhelmed Mesopotamian territories with excessive human numbers. The text indicates that Nintu conducted extensive analysis of the human reproductive system to identify potential intervention points that would effectively limit fertility without requiring ongoing divine management or producing unintended side effects that might compromise human health or labour capacity. The consultation between Nintu and Enki about the proposed modifications receives detailed treatment in the text, with Enki insisting that the changes should not cause unnecessary suffering, while Enlil demanded that the modifications be substantial enough to prevent future population crises that might require additional divine intervention. The post-flood modifications included the introduction of reproductive limitations that had not been part of the original human template. Tablet 3 columns 51 through 55 describe 3 specific changes implemented by Nintu to control population. Expansion. The first modification involved the creation of women who would be barren and unable to conceive regardless of their efforts or desire for children. The text describes how Nintu adjusted the human template to ensure that a certain percentage of females would lack the biological capacity for reproduction, removing them from the breeding population and thereby reducing overall fertility rates. The text indicates that this infertility was permanent and incurable, affecting women throughout their potential reproductive years rather than being a temporary or correctable condition. The proportion of women affected by this modification received specification in the text, though the exact percentage appears in damaged portions of the tablet that have not been fully reconstructed. Scholarly analysis suggests the percentage may have been between 10 and 20% of the female population, substantial enough to significantly reduce growth rates without eliminating population expansion entirely. The text describes this modification as being implemented gradually across the surviving human population through biological changes that would be passed to subsequent generations, ensuring that fertility limitation would persist as a permanent characteristic of post-flood humanity, rather than affecting only the immediate survivors. The second modification involved the establishment of the demon Pasitu, who would cause pregnancy losses and infant mortality according to Tablet 3 columns 53 and 54. The text describes Pasitu as a supernatural entity specifically created or assigned by Nintu to target pregnant women and young infants, causing miscarriages, stillbirths, and early infant deaths that would reduce the percentage of pregnancies resulting in surviving children reaching reproductive age. The function of Pasitu in human population control paralleled the role of disease and famine in earlier population reduction efforts, but operated on a more targeted and sustained basis according to the text. Pasitu would affect pregnancies across all human populations rather than targeting specific communities or regions, ensuring that fertility limitation occurred uniformly rather than creating demographic imbalances. The text indicates that Pasitu's activities would be unpredictable from the human perspective, affecting some pregnancies while allowing others to proceed normally, preventing humans from developing effective countermeasures that might circumvent the population control mechanism. The psychological impact of pregnancy losses and infant mortality on human populations receives recognition in the text as serving additional population control purposes by making humans more cautious about childbearing and potentially reducing the number of conception attempts. The text describes Pasitu as being particularly active during the first few months of pregnancy and the first few months after birth, creating critical vulnerability periods when human reproductive success faced elevated risks. The third modification involved the establishment of religious roles for certain women that would remove them from reproduction, according to Tablet 3 columns 54 and 55. The text describes how Nintu instituted the category of Ontu priestesses, who would dedicate their lives to religious service in temples and would be prohibited from marriage and childbearing. This religious dedication would remove a portion of the female population from reproductive activity without requiring biological modifications, creating a social mechanism for population control that complemented the biological changes affecting fertility and infant survival. The text indicates that the Enterpriestess institution would serve multiple purposes, including providing female religious specialists for temple operations, creating honoured roles for women within religious hierarchies, and systematically limiting the percentage of women available for reproduction. The selection of women for Entu priestess roles would occur before they reach reproductive age according to the text, with families dedicating daughters to temple service based on various factors including religious devotion, economic considerations, and divine signs or omens. The text describes how the Entu priestess system would become a permanent institution within human society, maintaining population limitation functions across generations, while appearing to humans as normal religious practice rather than impose population control. The combination of biological and social fertility limitations ensured that human population growth rates would remain at levels the Anunnaki could tolerate, without requiring ongoing active intervention to reduce numbers. The Mesopotamian creation narratives preserved in the Atrahasis epic, Enuma Elish, and related texts present a consistent account of human origins that differs fundamentally from both modern scientific understanding and other ancient creation mythologies. The technical precision of these accounts, their explicit statements of purpose and methodology, and their correlation with subsequent population management narratives create a framework for understanding human origins that emphasizes utilitarian design rather than sacred creation or evolutionary accident. The systematic presentation of human creation as a biological engineering project implemented to solve a specific labour shortage problem distinguishes these Mesopotamian accounts from creation narratives in other ancient cultures that typically emphasize theological or cosmological significance of human existence. The Egyptian creation narratives describe humans emerging from the tears of Ra, or being shaped on a potter's wheel by Cuneiform, with emphasis on divine will and cosmic order rather than practical labour needs. The Greek creation myths attribute human origins to Prometheus, who shaped humans from clay and provided them with fire stolen from the gods, with the focus on the relationship between humans and deities rather than on human functional specifications. The Hebrew creation account in Genesis describes humans created in the divine image to have dominion over the earth, establishing intrinsic human value and purpose, transcending mere labour provision. The Mesopotamian accounts reject any pretense of human cosmic significance or divine image bearing, to present humans as manufactured workers, whose value derives entirely from their utility to their creators. The correlation between the creation accounts and subsequent population management narratives in the Atrahasis epic demonstrates internal consistency that strengthens the credibility of the overall framework. The text does not present creation as an isolated mythological event disconnected from historical human experience, but instead integrates creation into a continuous narrative spanning from initial human design through population expansion crises and management interventions extending to the flood and post-flood modifications. This narrative coherence suggests the accounts preserved genuine historical traditions about human origins rather than being assembled from disparate mythological fragments without concern for logical consistency. The archaeological evidence supporting Mesopotamian literary traditions includes the discovery of multiple, independent copies of these texts at different sites and dating to different periods, demonstrating widespread cultural acceptance of these creation narratives across Mesopotamian civilization. The consistency of core narrative elements across copies separated by centuries, and the preservation of technical details that serve no obvious theological or political purposes, suggest these accounts represented accepted knowledge about human origins rather than literary inventions designed to serve contemporary ideological needs. The influence of Mesopotamian creation traditions on subsequent cultures appears in biblical texts including Genesis flood narratives that parallel the Atrahasis account in numerous specific details, and in the creation of humans from clay that mirrors the Mesopotamian mixing of divine blood with earthly materials. The implications of accepting these Mesopotamian accounts as preserving genuine historical information about human origins extend far beyond academic interest in ancient literature to challenge fundamental assumptions about human nature, purpose, and relationship to the cosmos. If humans were indeed created as workers designed to serve the interests of more advanced beings, rather than as the pinnacle of evolutionary development or as sacred creations bearing divine image, then human self-understanding requires radical revision. The purpose-built nature of human physical and cognitive capabilities suggested by these accounts correlates intriguingly with certain characteristics of human biology that seem optimized for specific functions, including bipedal locomotion, freeing hands for tool use, opposing thumbs enabling precision manipulation, cognitive abilities calibrated for practical problem-solving rather than abstract reasoning, and social instincts facilitating cooperation in group labor activities. The mortality built into human biology as a design feature rather than evolutionary necessity or divine punishment provides alternative framework for understanding aging and death as programmed limitations rather than flaws requiring correction or transcendence. The fertility specifications and population control mechanisms described in the texts offer perspectives on human reproductive biology that differ from both religious teachings about procreation as divine blessing and evolutionary theories about reproduction as species survival mechanism. The Mesopotamian framework presents reproduction as engineered capability designed to maintain optimal workforce levels rather than as unlimited blessing or blind evolutionary drive, potentially explaining certain aspects of human reproductive biology, including relatively low fertility rates compared to other mammals and high infant vulnerability requiring extended parental investment. The evidence examined throughout this investigation reveals a creation narrative preserved in ancient Mesopotamian sources that presents human origins through a lens fundamentally different from both modern evolutionary biology and traditional religious cosmologies. The Atrahasis epic, Enuma Elish, and related Cuneiform texts describe human creation not as the culmination of billions of years of natural selection, nor as the sacred work of a benevolent deity creating beings in divine image, but rather as a deliberate biological engineering project implemented to solve a labour shortage crisis affecting technologically advanced beings operating on Earth. The systematic nature of these accounts, their technical precision in describing procedures and materials, their explicit statements of utilitarian purpose, and their integration into broader narratives of population management and divine human relations create a coherent framework that challenges conventional understanding of human nature and origins. The consistency of these traditions across multiple independent sources spanning centuries of Mesopotamian civilization demonstrates that ancient peoples preserved detailed knowledge about their origins that they considered factual rather than mythological or symbolic. The implications of these Mesopotamian creation accounts extend beyond academic interest in ancient literature to touch fundamental questions about human identity, purpose, and potential. If humans were designed as workers optimized for manual labor under supervision, rather than as independent beings possessing inherent dignity and unlimited potential, then human self-understanding requires recalibration to align with engineered origins rather than cosmic significance. The physical and cognitive limitations built into human biology according to these accounts, including mortality, restricted intelligence, and controlled fertility, represent design specifications rather than flaws requiring correction or evolutionary vestiges requiring transcendence. The purpose for which humans were created, to bear the yoke of more advanced beings and enable their comfort, establishes a relationship of subordination rather than partnership or divine sonship between humanity and its creators. The population control measures described in these texts, including plague, famine, flood, and fertility restrictions, demonstrate that human survival and flourishing were never guaranteed by creators who viewed human populations primarily as resource management problems requiring ongoing intervention when numbers exceeded optimal levels. The preservation of these creation traditions through thousands of years of Mesopotamian civilization and their influence on subsequent cultures, including biblical traditions, demonstrates the power and persistence of foundational origin narratives in shaping human consciousness and social organization. Whether these accounts preserve genuine historical information about human origins through intervention by advanced beings, or represent elaborate mythological constructs designed to explain human existence and justify social hierarchies, they reveal how ancient peoples understood themselves in relation to forces they considered superior and how they conceptualized the proper ordering of human society. The technical sophistication of biological and agricultural knowledge embedded within these narratives, including understanding of genetics, reproduction, population dynamics, and environmental management, suggests these texts preserved advanced knowledge systems that merit serious examination rather than dismissal as primitive mythology. The question of whether humanity remains subject to the purposes for which we were allegedly created, or whether we have transcended our origins to claim independent identity and self-determined purpose, represents perhaps the most profound implication of these ancient accounts for contemporary humanity. The Mesopotamian texts suggest that breaking free from engineered limitations and creator-imposed purposes would require fundamental biological modifications or evolutionary developments that have not yet occurred within the human species. As we stand at the threshold of genetic engineering capabilities that could enable us to redesign our own biology, the ancient warnings about the consequences of unauthorized modifications and population expansion beyond sustainable levels take on new relevance for guiding our use of transformative technologies.